from this region. It's a biodiversity hotspot in every sense, but it's also a deforestation hotspot. So this is the remaining forest cover as of 10 years ago. It's less today. And the drivers of that deforestation are a variety of different crops, but primarily today it's oil palm. So this graph shows the exponential increase in oil palm over the last 30 to 40 years. So the world's forests are becoming more and more fragmented, and the majority of the remaining forest in the world is now near an edge. That is especially true in Southeast Asia. So this map shows the distance of edge for different across the world's forest, and you can see Southeast Asia has very little blue except for the heart of Borneo. Okay, so we're focusing on there. So what does that mean? This is what the forests look like today. They're patches of forest in a sea of oil palm. Not exclusively. Sometimes the sea can be rubber, but there are also more and more of the forest remaining is on steep areas that are not valuable for planting. So what I want to know is what's going on with the wildlife in those remaining forests, and are the herbivores being controlled by top-down or bottom-up resources? But Southeast Asia is also a hunting hotspot. That's because the population density in the region is 5 to 10 times higher than in the Congo or the Amazon. There's just more people. But as I'll talk about, people aren't hunting the same everywhere. They are very particular in the species they are targeting, and that varies in the different regions. And so that has important implications for the wildlife that remains in these forests. Okay. So there are 3 common cascades that occur in fragmented tropical forests in Asia, and we can test for them. The first is what we might call a defaunation cascade. All the large animals are removed, maybe rodents become more abundant, and they, as seed predators, can have a negative effect on seed recruitment, potentially, on tree recruitment. Then we have trophic cascades, what most people are familiar with. You lose your predators, you get more herbivores, they might overconsume the vegetation. Okay, might have lower seedling and sapling recruitment. And then we have a bottom-up subsidy cascade. Now, this can happen naturally. Let's say there's the weather conditions are just right that the forest fruits more often. So you have more fruit, that actually cascades up the food chain to be more herbivores, and that can lead to more predators. Or you can have an artificial food source like oil palm. The important thing about oil palm being next door is it is only going to benefit a subset of species that will leave the forest. These are generalist species, habitat generalists, such as wild pigs or potentially macaque monkeys and a few other species. So first, I'm going to talk about how I use camera traps to study apex predators, which is very applicable for the predators here, both the I almost said dole, which is the Asian wild dog, the dingo, and coals. And I'm just going to do this because it shows how many different questions we can answer with our camera trapping. So 1, are tiger populations in Sumatra, are they stable? Are they decreasing? Are plantations suitable habitat? There's been a lot of reports of tigers in plantations. Plantation managers like to say, oil palm is great for tigers. So we need some empirical evidence to either agree or disagree with that. What are the drivers of tiger densities? What's driving their increases or decreases? Which forests remaining have viable tiger populations? And what's the total population size? So we can answer all of these with camera trapping. So just quick slide to give you a heads up on Sumatra. It is the a wave of deforestation hit it over the last 25 years, and over half the forest has been lost. So a place where changes are happening so dramatically that I would set my cameras and come back and the forest would be gone in that 2 or 3 month time. But it's also home to some of the most remaining beautiful intact landscapes, including the last place on Earth where orangutans, tigers, and rhinos and elephants all coexist, the Jungle Book. So we set camera traps in 3 of the UNESCO Rainforest Heritage Site forests. In the north, Gunung Leuser, in the middle, Kerinci Seblat, and in the south, Bukit Barisan Selatan. And we had very large camera trapping grids that covered between 500 and 1,000 square kilometers. And then we left the cameras for 2.5 months, came back, collected them, used that to create capture histories. We identified all the tigers based on their striping pattern. Striping pattern for tigers like a fingerprint. Named all the individuals, usually after our favorite rock bands, and then used spatial capture-recapture modeling to estimate their densities. And what do we find? Well, among the 3 national parks, Kerinci Seblat's densities were almost 1/2 lower than the other 2. And that was not surprising because when we were out there, we were finding tiger snares everywhere and tigers in snares. So what this highlighted is that this method is working because where we're observing lots of poaching, we are detecting lower tiger densities. And it's a very clear, direct observation of what is driving tiger densities at this park. It's pretty clear for us. Kerinci Seblat was also the place where almost 35% of our cameras were stolen, which is a great indicator for how much illegal activity is going on. Very expensive indicator. Another take-home message from this is that tigers are extremely extremely low densities in Sumatra, much lower than in the other range habitats. So in India, they might be 5 to 10 times higher than this. Okay? It's not exactly clear why, but our future work is addressing that exact question. Another thing that we did is we took our 3 tiger density estimates from our 3 parks, and we looked at other tiger density estimates from Sumatra and Peninsular Malaysia that had the same lowland rainforest habitat. And we looked at a number of different drivers of tiger densities. And you know what the best driver of tiger density is? What the researchers choose as the buffer distance around their camera trap grid to measure tiger densities. Obviously, that's not a true driver of tiger densities. What it means is that the methods that we use to estimate tiger densities are extremely important to determining the final result. And so what we're able to do is take all that data, camera trap data, and reanalyze it using the current spatially explicit capture-recapture methods and correct for that so that we had no trend with the buffer distance. And then we can actually look at variation in tiger densities that might be reflected by true differences. What this highlights is the ability to go back if you have camera trap data and update your results with new methods. And to do cross-site analyses using camera trap data that's collected slightly different ways because each individual survey can have its own detection probability, right? So you can use surveys from many different groups together. So when we did that, we had some covariates in these models that predicted tiger densities across Sumatra. And what we found is the year since 1996 actually had a positive effect on tiger densities. Now that sounds surprising, but it's not, because in the 1990s, poaching was rampant. I mean, just everywhere. And since then, there's been a lot of investment of NGOs and the government in Sumatra to control poaching. And what this indicates is that's been effective. Tiger densities have significantly increased through time. It's a great story. But tiger densities are lower in landscapes where the deforestation rate is higher, and they're lower in secondary forests. Why is that? Almost for sure, access, because of roads, logging roads, is access for poachers. Okay? Now, what we found is when we estimated the actual number of tigers based on the density in each different habitat through time, even though the densities are increasing, the total number of tigers is decreasing. That's because the tigers can't increase as fast as people cut down forest. So what we're doing is we're packing more tigers into smaller forests. So then what we did is we said, okay, where's the remaining forest, and what are the densities in each of those forests? And we use that to estimate the population size in each of the remaining forests in Sumatra and identify these key landscapes where there are source populations where there's enough individuals to avoid inbreeding over a 100-year period. And so with our camera trapping, we're able to answer the questions of are tiger populations increasing or decreasing? They're decreasing. Are plantations suitable habitat? No, they're much lower densities, but they do persist in plantations where they're often causing trouble by deprecating livestock. Tigers' densities are driven by forest loss and like deforestation rate and secondary forest, and that's probably largely because of poaching. And the wild population, 618. Which is what people like to know. And we're able to identify the forest of viable population, potential viable populations over long periods of time. So that just highlights a single species application of camera trapping how valuable it can be. All right, so next we wanted to look at patterns of apex predator extirpations. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean across Asia, we want to look at, is there a systematic loss of first go tigers, then go leopards, then go clouded leopard, then go dhole? Are apex predators all being lost in succession, right? Or are they idiosyncratic? One is being poached out here, another one being poached out there. Why does this matter? Because these guys have different prey species. And so it also matters for their conservation because each one of these animals is either vulnerable or threatened or endangered or critically endangered. So these red points on this map indicate places where we expanded our camera trapping throughout 2 sites in Thailand, 2 sites in Peninsular Malaysia, Singapore, and 2 sites in Borneo. And since coming to UQ, Zachary Amir, PhD student of mine, has taken over the analyses here. And so these next figures are from him. So what we found is the apex predator communities might be a little bit small. In each one of these landscapes, it's very idiosyncratic. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to get one measure of forest that could capture fragmentation, forest loss, and isolation. And there is one now. It's called forest integrity. And that forest integrity is, it actually came out of a lab in UQ. And so it incorporates many different aspects of forest quality into a single metric. So as forest integrity increases, that means a more intact forest with further from an edge and less fragmented. So when we look at our apex predator losses with our forest integrity, what we find is as integrity increases, so that's going to the right here, forest integrity is increasing, you do get fewer extirpations. But what I think is more important about this graph is how much variation there is. What that means is different sites have either experienced in otherwise similar forest, lots of extirpations or very few. This is probably due to site-specific poaching and maybe the histories of poaching over longer periods of time. So a key question for tiger researchers was what is driving tiger densities and is it prey availability? And so we wanted to look at the relationship between tigers and prey. Now in India, people have found there's a strong relationship, positive relationship between tiger and prey, but they didn't look at individual species. Which species are important for tigers? Is it deer? Is it pigs? Is it tapirs? And so what we did is we used end mixture modeling, which is a type of occupancy modeling, to look at what how the abundance of prey predicted the abundance of predators. And what we found is as prey increased for sandbar deer, which is the largest deer species, tiger abundance also increased. So we're seeing a positive correlation there. But as wild boar increased, tiger densities actually declined. That might be because wild boar are found in areas that tigers are not as likely to go. So it could either be driven by a third variable, right? That they're both responding to. And so to look at that, we incorporated forest integrity and prey into the same model. And here what we find is that as shown in the bottom graphs, tigers are more common with higher forest integrity. There's a positive effect of forest integrity. That's not surprising. They like large intact landscapes. But there's a positive effect of sandbar deer, but a negative effect of wild boar. So this is a very strong and interesting result that we have not come to grips with. But it appears that wherever wild boar are thriving, tigers are not thriving. So our conclusion so far that apex predator extirpations are largely idiosyncratic, they're random. There's a trend where there's more extirpations in more fragmented and deforested areas, but it's not a strong relationship. And that sandbar deer prey depletion may limit tigers. All right, so our first cascades question is, will the loss of apex predators trigger trophic cascades? And so I want to quickly just revisit our 3 possible cascade scenarios. And here we're talking about the loss of apex predators triggering an increase in prey. And so what we're predicting there is that as the apex predator abundance declines, so here it would be going toward the axis, you'd get higher prey availability. That would indicate release from predation. Alternatively, if both tigers and the prey are both being hunted, there could be sites with high densities of both, or low densities of both, or if all species at this site are being bottom-up regulated by limited food, which is limiting the prey, which is limited tigers. In both of those scenarios, you could see a positive relationship between predators and prey. So we're really testing this incredibly basic relationship. Is it positive or negative? And what we find is for wild boar, it's negative, and that also holds true, but is not significant for macaque. But for all the other large ungulates, there was no significant relationship. What that means is, as tiger densities increase or decrease, there was no significant change in prey abundances. So that indicates that there's only potentially trophic release, which could lead to a trophic cascade for wild boar and maybe potentially macaques. All right, so next I want to look at bottom-up cascades. So what this graph is showing here, or what this image is showing here, are flowering trees in a Southeast Asian rainforest. And what's important to know about Southeast Asia is it only produces, the vast majority of fruit is only produced during an ENSO, El Nino year. The drought associated with an ENSO event is what triggers the trees to reproduce. So what this graph is showing is over a 4-year period, there are years when very little fruiting occurs. And then there are boom years when a vast majority of the trees will all of a sudden all reproduce at once. So that means likely in these lean years, the wildlife could be bottom up limited by a lack of resources because the trees are not fruity. Now let's look at forests today. They're adjacent to oil palm plantation. Oil palm produces more fruit than any other crop on earth continuously throughout the year for 25 years on end. It's the exact opposite phenology that would naturally be found for a Southeast Asian rainforest. Oh, it's not surprising that you might expect some pigs living in a primary rainforest to venture out and consume oil palm plantation fruit that falls to the ground next door. And so we studied this process in Peninsular Malaysia at a site called Paso. And here what we did is we looked at the wild boar in forest, which we measured via their nests. Wild boar are great because each reproductive female makes a nest when it gives birth. So it leaves a very clear track of one individual. So you can count that and have a very confident estimate of their population size. And we looked at their number of nests in our research plot over a long period of time. And what we found is this 2 orders of magnitude drop and then increase. We're trying to figure out why that could have been. And it just so happens that the drop coincided with when the oil palm plantations were all cut down around that forest. So what we did is we went to the plantations and we got their data on where they rotated and when the fruiting began again, and we modeled that. And it turns out that the crash happens right when the oil palm is cleared and they come back right when the oil palm begins fruiting again. It's very strong evidence that oil palm is subsidizing these pigs, and the pig populations are not being driven by changes in apex predators, for example. This is about as strong evidence as we get in these natural experiments. So what this map is showing here is the forest integrity across Southeast Asia. This is that measure I was talking about earlier that incorporates forest logging, loss, fragmentation, and edges. And so these pie charts are showing the amount of each habitat. And what you can tell from far away is that there's a lot of red and yellow. And that means forest that is either near an edge, fragmented, et cetera, low forest integrity. So we did a meta-analysis or a review, and we looked at the density from studies that were conducted in these different forests, and we classified them into different forest integrity categories. What we find is the density of pigs throughout the region is 10 times higher in these poor forest integrity forests than in the interior primary forest. So that pattern that I was describing from Paso seems to be present throughout the region. So then what we did is we used our camera traps to do some occupancy analyses, and we did it at 2 scales. One, we looked at we classified the entire survey as one site, and we just looked at what is the percent of oil palm in that entire landscape within a 20-kilometer radius. So just landscapes with and without lots of oil palm. And then we looked at within a landscape, what's the percentage of oil palm within a 1-kilometer radius of every single camera. And in both cases, you see as oil palm increases, these 4 species, wild boar, bearded pig, long-tailed macaque, and pigtail macaque, all increase with oil palm. But wild boar respond most at large scales, which is not surprising given their home range, whereas the macaques respond stronger at small scales, which could reflect that they have smaller home ranges. But either way, oil palm seems to be driving very large changes. So then we want to move toward looking at entire food webs. And so we built food webs using our camera traps by first taking the occupancy of every single species as 30, and I'm just limiting this to the 13. This list here is named for the 13 most common ones, but there's obviously more shown here. And we looked at how the food webs change in interior forest versus fragments. And what I want you to focus on as I go back and forth here is that moving forward in fragments, number 6 is the wild boar, and leopard cat is a small predator. You see this shift in the important food web nodes going from large apex predators to small mesopredators, and from a variety of different herbivores and omnivores all coalescing into pigs and macaques. I mean, these animals are becoming really important nodes in these food webs. All right. Next, I'm going to talk about the effects that pigs in particular have on the forest. And I'm just going to just make sure that we're all on the same page. Oil palm, forest degradation, driving huge pig abundances across Southeast Asia. What does that happen? What does that mean for the actual forest, the trees? Interestingly, pig nests, and this is a photo of a pig nest, is one of the key disturbances. Pigs rip out 200, 300 stems, build a nest when they give birth. They do that twice a year for and when conditions are very good. That adds up to thousands and thousands of saplings being removed over years. So in this study, we had a fenced exclosure experiment, and we looked at tree reproduction inside and outside over 20 years. This was built by a colleague, Kaylin Ickes, and I went back and recensused it. And I don't need to show you any graphs because you can just see inside the fenced area, it's all green, and outside the fenced area, it's brown. The soil is turned up. The pigs have removed many of the stems. And what you can't really tell here is the remaining stems are often lianas. Why is that? If you've ever tried to rip out a liana, they're really hard to rip out. It's not surprising that pigs are not being able to rip them out as often as a nice tree sapling. Okay, so now when we go to our 50-hectare research plot and we look at the total number of stems when it was started, 1986 versus 2010, we see the size distribution is completely changed. So in 1986, we had 80,000 more of the smallest stems. These are over here in the tree size diameter, all the way to the left is the smallest stems. Whereas in 2010, we've lost 80,000 stems there, right? We're just missing our seedlings and saplings. So what this means is wild boar are clearing the understory and utterly suppressing tree reproduction. There's also some interesting effects on the forest function. So what we also found is that the percent of stems remaining that are lianas is much higher where pigs are abundant in the outside the fences in this case versus where pigs are excluded. What that means is, like I was saying before, pigs are preferentially killing trees likely because they're easier to pull out and make a nest with. As you probably know, lianas, increasing abundance of lianas will have negative effects likely on the carbon storage potential of that forest because they compete with trees, but they sequester much less carbon. They also just change the structure and the function of the forest in many ways. An interesting thing we also found, though, is that the presence of pig nests was associated with higher species evenness. Okay, so what these graphs show is the green is in quadrats in our 50-hectare plot where there was without pig nests, whereas the yellow shows sites that did have pig nests. And this is before and after, or over a 5-year period, before and after meaning in 1995 versus 2000. And so what happens is pigs choose to make nests in areas where there's lots of common species. And they preferentially make nests in clumps of saplings because it's easier to build a house near a lumberyard, right? They just go to where it's easy to make their nest. And the combination of those factors leads to higher mortality of common species. And so when you measure species evenness, it actually increases in areas where there's pig nesting. However, we still lost 80,000 stems, which was 64% of all saplings in that smallest size class. So I want you to take that positive effect on diversity, on species evenness, in context. It's not meaning the forest is going to have more tree species. It just means that the processes through which pigs destroy the forest have a positive effect on species evenness. Makes sense? Kind of, I don't know, whatever. Makes sense to me, but I've studied it for a long time. All right. So to summarize that section, pigs and macaques benefit from oil palm. Pigs cause severe changes to the vegetation. And a large percentage of the remaining forests in Southeast Asia are likely facing some of these issues. So what are the controls on pigs? Well, everyone probably likes bacon. I don't eat meat, but many people do. So obviously people are going to hunt pigs, right? Well, that's true in areas where their religious taboos don't put a food taboo on eating pork. So in this situation, yes, hunters are going to reduce pigs and deer and many other species altogether. However, there are huge areas of Southeast Asia that are dominated by Muslim. The population is predominantly Muslim, and the Muslim has the halal diet has a food taboo on pork. So people have very little incentive to hunt pork. They avoid pork. So what that means in these areas that it might be dominated by Islam versus Christianity or Buddhism, Confucianism, or, Chinese ethnic groups and their religions, you can have a divergence in what people are hunting. So you might assume that in Christian areas or in areas where there are not predominantly Islam, you might not see these huge increases in pigs, whereas those huge increases in pigs would be common if people are not hunting. So what we're doing is we're quantifying. So what this graph is showing is the proportion of each ethnic group in each of the major regions of Asia, of Southeast Asia. And we've done this also around each of our study sites to try to identify what are the sites with the majority population of each religion. So we can test this. And we have two key locations that are both in Malaysia, one in Peninsular Malaysia, one in Borneo, that differ strongly in their ethnic makeup and in the exact predictable way. So this is the same site I just discussed. It's Paso, Peninsular Malaysia. The dominant religion in that area is Islam. People rarely hunt pigs. There are some pig hunters. Chinese people do hunt pigs in this area, but it's not that common. And the pigs are also subsidized by oil palm, which is adjacent to the forest. And as I explained earlier, what this graph is showing is the number of tree saplings through time. The increase in pigs has led to a decline in tree saplings. And we contrasted that with a site called Lambert Hills in Borneo, where the majority population around there is Dayak and Chinese. And so there, pig hunting is very common. In fact, hunting bearded pigs is really ingrained in the Dayak culture, and they're good at it. They can hunt a lot of pigs if they want. And so what you see there is even though the same forest is adjacent to oil palm, pigs are not extirpated, but they're at extremely low densities. And when you look at the number of saplings through time, since defaunation has happened recently in Lambert, what we're seeing is an increase in the tree saplings year after year. And the effect of that is actually huge. So it's not, it's almost 35% more tree saplings, okay? So we're seeing huge changes over decades in the tree forest recruitment, driven by either a plethora of pigs or an absence of pigs. Okay, so our next stage in what we're doing in my lab is start to look at the synergetic effects of having multiple cascading or multiple changes to the ecological controls on these food webs. And what I mean by that is looking at the effect of both losing a predator and having oil palm in the landscape versus having one or the other, or oil palm, predator loss, and hunting, any combination of those factors. And we're doing that using structural equation modeling, which I'll show at the very end. But I just want to take a little stop here and get our minds back to thinking about how this applies to Australia. In Australia, we also have fragmented forests. We also have predator losses. We also have pigs, and we actually have sandbar deer, which are invasive. Pigs are invasive. And then we have, unlike Southeast Asia, we have a very interesting additional predator in foxes, cats. And so we can use these same tools to start to look at, not start to, a lot of people are already doing this work, but I think there's a lot of opportunities to look at it. We can use the same camera trapping tools and analytical tools that I was using in Asia in Queensland to study the same effects. And like how oil palm might be subsidizing pigs, sugarcane has been shown to do the same, both in its native range in India and Pakistan. Some of the highest pig densities ever recorded are around sugarcane plantations, but also in pigs introduced range, both here in Australia, but also there's a lot of research coming out of Brazil, where introduced pigs are very abundant in these fragmented forests surrounded by sugarcane. So you really couldn't paint a more analogous food web here to start studying the same kind of questions in a totally new location, new continent. I think it's a lot of opportunities. But how did we do it last time? Well, we brought together, for me, 12 years of being in the field, spending $200,000, $300,000 collecting camera trap surveys, years and years and years of my life being covered in leeches, mosquitoes. But we don't need to do that. There's already so many camera trapping surveys conducted and currently being conducted in Queensland. If we had a working group or consortium to bring that together, we could save ourselves a decade and $300,000 or $400,000. Actually, here it would be millions because costs are much lower for hiring people to do this kind of field work in Southeast Asia. And so there's a huge opportunity to answer these questions very quickly and comparatively cheaply if we got together to bring together camera trapping from a variety of different stakeholders. Further, it's a thing. There's lots of examples of this. eMammal, which is becoming Wildlife Insights, is a global network that brings together camera trap data, and they ask you to standardize it, upload it, and then you get to put your own terms of how it can be used. This is another one from the team, another Smithsonian initiative, but this one is setting out systematic camera trapping in tropical forests around the world. And even in New South Wales, they monitor 200 locations, and they have a website to upload data and to see everything, and they have citizen science being involved. And it's just really like an ideal model for us to maybe build off of. And so it's even occurring in other places in Australia. But something like this currently doesn't exist in Queensland. And that matters because the wet tropics are for sure the coolest ecosystem where we should be focusing our research. And so my goal, my aim, what I want to do here, now that I've recently moved to Australia and I'm trying to establish myself, is to fill this void, sit between different organizations and collate data and produce the analytical tools so that people can analyze it and answer questions related to ecology and conservation easily, cheaply, robustly, and I think it's very possible. So there's some logistics that we should talk about. What is entailed if you join this? Well, anyone can join. We're going to try to get MOUs with the major government agencies and NGOs. These are things like CSIRO, Wet Tropics Management Authority, National Parks, Australian Wildlife Conservancy, WCS, WWF, etc. Because all of these people have enough data alone to make to start conducting the analyses that I've been doing, let alone if they combine forces. We can really fill in key gaps too, because each one of these groups has areas that they focus on, but each one might be missing important information from the land where they don't work. So what will I do, or my lab will hopefully be able to standardize the cam trapping data so that it can be all analyzed together in one big model, and will provide the best practices for doing that. And if I have it my way, which I've done for Southeast Asia, is I actually have created an online tool that you can analyze your camera trap data just by clicking a few buttons. That makes it accessible for land managers and people making decisions to actually make inferences from this data. It will be secure, not accessible to the public, but if you're a PhD student and you had a question and you came to the group and said, I'd like to understand how northern coal population density or abundances vary across the range and in relation to habitat fragmentation and elevation, and if pigs affect that. You would come and say that, and I would say, okay, let's ask if everyone was willing to contribute their data. Yes, 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 yes. I would then say, yes, everyone's willing for you to use their data for that purpose. Would you like to use some of these models that we've been developing? Okay, here's the end mixture model already coded, ready to go. All you have to do is tailor it to your specific needs. But basically, it's the most robust analysis possible, and you don't have to spend 6 months trying to get it to work. It's already working. You just have to turn the knobs a little bit to suit your purpose. Okay. All right. So it will also be really invaluable as a monitoring tool. And monitoring is getting more and more respect. It didn't get a lot of respect for a lot of years, but I think people are coming around to it being really valuable. Second, there's limitless possibilities for research. I haven't seen a lot of work on the interacting effects of cats, foxes, pigs, and fragmentation and elevation all co-occurring in one landscape to try to understand how those interacting effects determine species populations in Queensland. So that's one example. Another one is that for example, PhD students or researchers in general, it's really hard to get $50,000 together to buy cameras and go out and do a big survey. So this makes it more accessible for researchers, especially young researchers, to get their hands on large data and make important inferences and answer important research questions that are hopefully relevant to ecology and conservation that they care about here in Queensland. Yeah, also we can leverage existing data. A lot of the things that I want to do can be done with what's already out there. We don't have to spend any more money collecting data. And we can use this to identify gaps where we really need to prioritize new data collection. All right. So eventually the holy grail here for me and my lab, and I think probably for a lot of people, is to build a model of the food web that includes how twisting any number of the knobs, both within the food web, like losing or gaining predators, gaining meaning new invasive predators, losing meaning losing certain species, affects other species, and how everything is affected by outside influences such as agriculture, hunting, logging, fragmentation, etc. This can be done using structural equation models where each one of your nodes is a different species, and you have these explanatory variables that are coming outside that can affect any number of the individual species, and then allows you to understand when one thing affects, let's say, a predator, what is the secondary effect on prey and the tertiary effect on vegetation. So this is a real one. It works. I've done it, but we're just starting to even get into the realm of being able to use this level of sophisticated models to understand the whole food web and outside influences on that food web. And it really presents an exciting future. So if all that, what we were able to do in Asia was interesting, in my opinion, we're just getting started. And the use of structural equation models is really going to leverage what we can do even further. Thank you.